The dining chairs faced each other across a warped wooden table, their occupants still seated after 50 years beneath the mud. When the spring floods of 1961 receded from Miller's Bend, they left behind more than fallen trees and ruined crops. The water had shifted the earth around the old Hayes cabin, exposing a foundation that locals thought had washed away decades earlier. Inside, the Buchanan County coroner found them exactly as they had been on that March night in 1911. Thomas Hayes at the head of the table, his wife Margaret to his right, their 3 children arranged in birth order along the wooden benches. 5 place settings of chipped ceramic waited for a supper that never came. The floodwaters that killed them had also preserved them, sealing the cabin in layers of silt and clay that turned their final meal into a 50-year tomb. What had kept an entire family sitting calmly as death rose around their ankles? The Nodaway River had always been a treacherous neighbor to the farmers along its banks in northwestern Missouri. In the spring of 1911, snowmelt from Iowa and Nebraska swelled its tributaries beyond recognition, turning gentle creeks into roaring torrents that swept away bridges, livestock, and the occasional homestead, foolish enough to settle too close to the water's edge. Thomas Hayes knew the risks when he built his cabin on the bend 3 miles upstream from Maryville. But good bottomland was scarce, and the soil there grew corn tall enough to hide a man on horseback. The Hayes family had moved to Nodaway County from Kentucky 5 years earlier, drawn by promises of cheap land and the railroad boom that was transforming rural Missouri. Thomas worked his 160 acres with the methodical precision of a man who had learned farming on rockier ground, while Margaret kept a garden that supplied vegetables to 3 neighboring families. Their children, 14-year-old William, 12-year-old Elizabeth, and 8-year-old Samuel, attended the one-room schoolhouse in Conception Junction when the roads allowed. March of 1911 arrived with unseasonable warmth that melted the winter's heavy snow in a matter of days. The Nodaway rose steadily through the first 2 weeks of the month, but Thomas had seen high water before. He moved his livestock to higher ground and checked the levees he had built to protect his cornfield. The river would crest, as it always did, then settle back into its banks with the patient rhythm that had shaped this valley for centuries. On March 18th, the rhythm broke. Ezra Whitman lived a quarter-mile downstream from the Hayes place, close enough to see the lamplight in their windows when darkness fell across the bottomland. A bachelor farmer who had homesteaded the same year as Thomas, Ezra possessed the watchful temperament of a man who slept lightly and trusted weather signs more than almanacs. That Saturday evening, something in the sound of the river made him step onto his porch with a kerosene lantern to check the water level against the cottonwood that marked his property line. The river had risen 2 feet since sunset. Ezra pulled on his boots and walked the muddy path toward the Hayes cabin, his lantern throwing nervous shadows across ground that squelched beneath his feet. The sound that had wakened him grew louder as he approached the river, not the steady rush of high water, but an irregular rumble that suggested debris moving in the current. Logs, most likely. Perhaps a barn or outbuilding torn loose from some upstream farm. When he reached the bend where the Hayes cabin sat, Ezra could see lamplight still glowing in the kitchen window. Through the glass, he glimpsed the family gathered around their dining table. Thomas appeared to be reading aloud from a book while Margaret mended something in her lap. The children sat quietly, their heads tilted toward their father's voice. The scene looked so peaceful that Ezra hesitated to disturb them with his concerns about the rising water. He raised his hand to knock on the door, then stopped. The river's sound had changed again, deeper now, more urgent. When he turned toward the water, his lantern revealed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The The Nodaway was running backward. The phenomenon Ezra witnessed that night would later be explained by engineers as a hydraulic dam. Massive debris forming a temporary barrier upstream, backing water into areas that had never flooded in recorded history. But standing in the mud with his lantern trembling in his grip, Ezra understood only that the natural order had reversed itself. Water flowed uphill toward the Hayes cabin, carrying with it the broken pieces of farms and lives from 20 miles of river valley. A barn door spun past like a playing card, then a wagon wheel still attached to its axle, then something that might have been a chicken coop, moving fast enough to crush anything in its path. The water rose with each piece of debris that swept past, climbing the gentle slope toward the cabin where the Hayes family continued their quiet evening meal. Ezra stumbled toward the house, shouting warnings that were lost in the river's roar. The water reached his knees, then his waist, the current strong enough to knock him sideways if he loosened his grip on the fence posts he used to pull himself forward. Through the kitchen window, he could still see the family at their table. Thomas had closed his book and was looking toward the window with an expression of mild curiosity, as if he had heard something but could not identify its source. The lamp went out when the water reached the windowsill. Ezra fought his way to higher ground and waited for dawn, expecting to find debris and possibly bodies when the flood receded. Instead, he found nothing. No cabin, no foundation, no trace that the Hayes family had ever lived on that bend of the Nodaway River. The flood had erased them as thoroughly as if they had never existed. For 50 years, their disappearance remained Nodaway County's most persistent mystery, until the river decided to give them back. Sheriff Henry Tolbert arrived at Miller's Bend 3 days after the flood with a search party that included 6 volunteers from Maryville and 2 bloodhounds borrowed from the county seat. The dogs whined and circled at the edge of the water, confused by scents that had been washed away or buried beneath tons of river mud. Where the Hayes cabin should have stood, they found only a depression filled with brown water that reflected the gray March sky. Swept downstream, Tolbert concluded, after walking the riverbank for 2 miles in each direction. Probably hung up in a log jam somewhere between here and the Missouri border. The theory satisfied most people who remembered the violence of that night's flood. Whole barns had been found 15 miles from their foundations, and the Hayes cabin had been built of pine lumber that would float until it rotted or burned. But Ezra Whitman could not forget what he had seen through that kitchen window. A family sitting calmly at their supper table while death rose around them. No panic. No attempt to flee to higher ground. Just 5 people waiting for something that never came. He shared his account with anyone who would listen, describing the lamplight and the open book and the way Margaret had continued mending while water lapped at the walls of their home. Most dismissed his story as the confused recollection of a man who had nearly drowned trying to save his neighbors. Trauma did strange things to memory, they said. The mind created order where chaos had reigned. The official record listed the Hayes family as missing, presumed dead by drowning. Their land reverted to the county for unpaid taxes within 2 years. By 1914, corn grew where their cabin had stood, and newcomers to Nodaway County learned nothing of the family that had vanished in the flood. Time buried them deeper than the river ever could. The Nodaway Valley carried more than agricultural runoff in the decades following the Great Flood of 1911. It carried the accumulated silence of neighbors who had chosen not to ask difficult questions about the night the Hayes family disappeared. Ezra Whitman's account, dismissed as trauma-induced confusion, contained details that lingered in the memories of those who had known the family well. Thomas Hayes had been quarreling with the Farmers' Alliance over grain prices in the weeks before the flood. Several members suspected him of selling corn to Kansas City dealers instead of the cooperative mill in Maryville, undercutting prices that other farmers depended on to survive the economic uncertainty that preceded America's entry into the Great War. The accusations had grown heated enough that Thomas had stopped attending alliance meetings and kept his children home from school more often than the truancy officer thought necessary. Margaret Hayes had confided to her closest neighbor, Anna Morrison, that strange men had been asking questions about her husband's business dealings. Men who claimed to represent grain buyers but seemed more interested in Thomas's movements than his crop yields. When Anna mentioned this conversation to Sheriff Tolbert during the search, he noted it in his report, but took no action to investigate the identity of these mysterious visitors. The children's school teacher, Miss Catherine Holbrook, remembered that William Hayes had arrived at school with bruises on his arms during the week before the flood. When questioned, the boy claimed he had fallen from the hayloft, but Miss Holbrook noticed that he flinched when other children approached him too quickly. She meant to speak with his parents about her concerns, but the flood came before she could arrange a visit to their cabin. These fragments of suspicion might have coalesced into a formal investigation under different circumstances. But the violence of that March night provided a convenient explanation for the Hayes family's disappearance, and Nodaway County had more pressing concerns than pursuing ghosts in a world torn by war and economic upheaval. What would you do, faced with neighbors whose stories didn't quite align with physical evidence? Would you press for answers that might implicate people you knew and trusted? Or would you accept the comfort of a natural disaster that required no human villain? Among the papers salvaged from the Maryville post office after a fire in 1913, Postal Inspector Robert McKenna discovered a canvas mail sack that had been stored in the basement since the flood of 1911. Water damage had rendered most of its contents illegible, but 3 letters addressed to the Hayes family survived well enough to be transcribed. McKenna included them in his report to the postal authorities, who filed the documents without further investigation. The first letter, postmarked March 15, 1911, from Louisville, Kentucky, read, "Thomas, your brother James has agreed to the arrangement. Bring the samples to the meeting place as discussed. Trust no one else with this matter. The consequences for failure will extend beyond yourself." The second letter, dated March 17th, bore no return address, but contained a single paragraph. "Mr. Hayes, our associates in Kansas City have been informed of your decision to withdraw from our agreement. This development disappoints us greatly. We trust you will reconsider before permanent arrangements become necessary." The third letter arrived the day after the flood, addressed to Mrs. Margaret Hayes in a woman's careful script. It contained a recipe for preserving vegetables and news of mutual acquaintances in Kentucky, along with a postscript that read, "I pray this letter finds you well and that Thomas has resolved his difficulties with those terrible men he mentioned in his last correspondence." McKenna's report documented these letters as evidence of the Hayes family's continued correspondence with relatives and associates prior to their disappearance. He noted that the family appeared to have been involved in some form of business dispute, but found no evidence that this dispute had contributed to their fate during the flood. The letters were stored in the county courthouse basement, where they remained undisturbed for the next 48 years. The arrangement mentioned in the first letter, the associates in Kansas City, the terrible men who had concerned Margaret enough to mention them in correspondence with relatives. Each phrase suggested connections that reached far beyond a farming dispute in rural Missouri. But the dead, as everyone knew, could not answer questions about the living. The patrons of husbandry maintained a chapter house 2 miles east of Maryville, where farmers gathered monthly to discuss crop prices, railroad shipping rates, and the political maneuvering that determined whether their families would prosper or fail in the brutal economics of agricultural life. The Grange had been instrumental in organizing the Farmers' Alliance that Thomas Hayes had abandoned in the weeks before his disappearance, and its members included some of the most influential landowners in Nodaway County. Minutes from the March meeting, held 9 days before the flood, recorded a heated discussion about disloyal members who undermined collective bargaining through individual arrangements with outside buyers. While no names were mentioned in the official record, several members later confirmed that the discussion centered on Thomas Hayes and his alleged dealings with grain speculators from Kansas City. Walter Brennan, who owned the largest farm in the township, had proposed that the alliance take direct action against members who violated their agreements. The motion failed to receive a second, but the discussion that followed revealed the depth of anger felt by farmers who believed Hayes was profiting at their expense during a year when corn prices had dropped nearly 30% from the previous season. "A man's got to choose sides," Brennan declared, according to witnesses who attended the meeting. "He's either with his neighbors or against them. And if he's against them, well, the alliance has ways of making that a costly decision." The Grange secretary, Edwin Morrison, recorded Brennan's comments without editorial comment, noting only that considerable debate ensued regarding member obligations and enforcement mechanisms. Morrison's wife, Anna, was the same neighbor to whom Margaret Hayes had confided her fears about strange men asking questions about her husband's business. After the flood swept away the Hayes family, the Grange meetings returned to mundane discussions of seed prices and railroad schedules. Walter Brennan's farm prospered through the war years, expanding to include much of the bottomland that had once belonged to smaller farmers who could not survive the economic pressures of consolidated agriculture. The alliance disbanded in 1918, its members scattered by war and economic changes that transformed farming. From Josiah Fletcher operated the First National Bank of Maryville with the cautious precision of a man who had survived 3 economic panics by never extending credit beyond his ability to foreclose. His ledgers recorded every transaction in copperplate script that revealed as much about his customers' moral character as their financial standing. The entries concerning Thomas Hayes told a story that Fletcher kept to himself until his death in 1927. Hayes had borrowed against his land twice in the 6 months before the flood, ostensibly to purchase seed and equipment for the spring planting. But Fletcher's private notes, discovered among his papers by his successor, suggested a different purpose for the loans. Customer appears nervous, requests cash rather than bank draft, claims need for immediate payment to suppliers in Kansas City, behavior inconsistent with normal agricultural financing patterns. The most revealing entry appeared in Fletcher's personal journal under the date March 10, 1911. Hayes visited bank after hours, entered through rear entrance, repaid both outstanding loans in full, payment made in gold coin rather than paper currency. Origin of payment unclear. Customer refused to discuss source of funds, appeared anxious to complete transaction quickly. Suspect involvement in irregular commodity trading. Fletcher had good reason to suspect irregular trading. The grain markets in 1911 operated with minimal federal oversight, creating opportunities for speculation that enriched some farmers while ruining others. A farmer with advanced knowledge of crop conditions or railroad shipping schedules could manipulate local prices through carefully timed sales to buyers in distant cities. But gold coins suggested something beyond simple market manipulation. Currency of that type typically indicated transactions that required anonymity, deals that participants preferred not to document in conventional banking records. Fletcher noted that Hayes carried the gold in a leather pouch that showed signs of frequent handling, suggesting that the March transaction was not his first dealing in untraceable payment. The banker filed no reports with federal authorities about Hayes's unusual financial activities. His responsibility, as he saw it, was to his depositors and shareholders, not to abstract questions of market fairness or legal compliance. When the flood eliminated his most puzzling customer, Fletcher recorded the loans as satisfied and turned his attention to more conventional agricultural lending. The gold that had troubled him disappeared with the Hayes family, taking its secrets beneath the muddy waters of the Nodaway River. Spring floods of 1961 brought the worst flooding to the Nodaway Valley since 1911, displacing families and destroying crops across 3 counties. When the waters receded in late April, they revealed changes in the landscape that confused longtime residents who thought they knew every bend and oxbow of their ancestral river. County Surveyor James Mitchell was mapping flood damage for insurance claims when his transit revealed an anomaly near Miller's Bend. The topographical features didn't match his survey maps from 1958. A depression that should have been 4 feet deep now measured 12 feet, while an adjacent hillside showed signs of recent erosion that exposed what appeared to be foundation stones. Mitchell initially attributed the changes to the normal processes of flood scouring, but closer examination revealed something that made him call the county sheriff. The foundation stones were arranged in a perfect rectangle 20 feet by 30 feet, with remnants of wooden beams still mortised into the corners. Most unsettling were the household items scattered around the perimeter: cast iron skillets, ceramic fragments, and the unmistakable remains of furniture that had been preserved by 50 years of anaerobic burial. Sheriff Daniel Kowalski arrived with the county coroner and a photographer who documented the scene before excavation began. What they uncovered challenged every assumption about the Hayes family's fate and raised questions that would haunt Nodaway County for decades to come. The cabin had not been swept away by the flood of 1911. It had been buried by it, sealed beneath layers of silt and debris that created a perfect preservation chamber. And inside that chamber, the Hayes family waited exactly where Ezra Whitman had last seen them, seated around their supper table as if expecting guests who had never arrived. The cabin's interior defied every natural law that should have governed 50 years of submersion and decay. The floodwaters that buried the Hayes family had also protected them, creating an environment so lacking in oxygen that decomposition had proceeded at a glacial pace. Their bodies, mummified by the alkaline clay that filled the structure, retained enough tissue that the coroner could determine not only their identities, but the circumstances of their deaths. None had drowned. Dr. Richard Pemberton, who served as Nodaway County's chief medical examiner, found no water in the lungs of any family member. Their deaths had occurred before the flood reached them, sometime during the evening hours when neighbors would have expected to see lamplight in their windows. The positioning of the bodies suggested they had died while seated at their table, their final meal interrupted by something swift and final. Toxicological analysis revealed traces of strychnine in the tissue samples, not enough to determine lethal dosage after 50 years, but sufficient to indicate poisoning as the cause of death. The same alkaline conditions that had preserved their bodies had also maintained chemical evidence that would have vanished under normal burial conditions. The supper table itself provided additional clues that transformed the investigation from a historical curiosity into an active homicide case. 5 place settings of mismatched china surrounded a serving bowl that still contained the desiccated remains of what appeared to be stew or soup. A 6th setting waited at the foot of the table, its plate empty, its spoon positioned as if the guest had been expected to serve himself. Dr. Pemberton's preliminary examination of the 6th place setting revealed residue that tested positive for strychnine at concentrations far higher than the trace amounts found in the victims' bodies. Someone had prepared poison for the Hayes family's final meal, then waited to ensure its effectiveness before departing into the night. The killer had set a place for himself at their table. The sixth-place setting haunted investigators more than the preserved bodies of the Hayes family themselves. It suggested a level of premeditation that transformed a frontier murder into something approaching ritualistic execution. Someone had accepted the family's hospitality, shared their table, and watched them die before disappearing into the March darkness that preceded the flood. Sheriff Kowalski reopened the 1911 missing persons case and began interviewing elderly residents who might remember details about the Hayes family's final weeks. Most had died or moved away in the 50 years since the flood, but a few recalled fragments of conversation that took on new significance in light of the physical evidence. Ezra Whitman's nephew, Thomas Whitman, had inherited his uncle's farm and his meticulous record-keeping habits. Among Ezra's papers, Thomas discovered a journal entry dated March 16, 1911, 2 days before the flood. Stranger called on the Hayes place today. Well-dressed man riding a bay horse. Stayed for supper. Left after dark, heading toward town. Something about him made me uneasy. The journal entry continued with observations that Ezra had apparently deemed too speculative to share with Sheriff Tolbert's original investigation. The stranger carried himself like a man accustomed to deference. City clothes, but he knew enough about farming to discuss crop yields intelligently with Thomas. Not a grain buyer, something else. Margaret seemed nervous throughout his visit, kept glancing toward the children. Anna Morrison, now 83, and living with her daughter in St. Joseph, provided the clearest description of the mysterious visitor when Sheriff Kowalski interviewed her in June of 1961. Medium height, dark hair, expensive coat. He had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. When I asked Margaret about him the next day, she said Thomas had invited him for supper to discuss business matters. But she seemed frightened, kept saying she hoped the business would be concluded soon. The business, whatever it was, had concluded with 5 deaths and a mystery that survived a half-century of burial beneath Missouri mud. Strychnine and silver spoons. Sheriff Kowalski's investigation expanded beyond Nodaway County when Dr. Pemberton's autopsy revealed metal fragments in Thomas Hayes's clothing that appeared to be portions of a railroad watch. The watch had stopped at 9:47, providing a precise time of death that allowed investigators to correlate the murders with train schedules and business records from Kansas City's grain exchange. The Kansas City Board of Trade maintained meticulous records of commodity transactions dating back to 1876. Among the files for March 18, 1911, investigators discovered evidence of irregular corn futures trading that involved fictitious purchases designed to manipulate prices across multiple markets. The scheme required advanced knowledge of crop damage reports that would not be publicly available until after the spring planting season. Thomas Hayes appeared in the exchange records as the source of detailed agricultural intelligence from Nodaway County and surrounding areas. His reports on soil conditions, weather patterns, and planted acreage allowed conspirators to place futures bets with near certainty of profit. The scheme had netted an estimated $50,000 between January and March of 1911, equivalent to nearly $1.5 million in 1961 dollars. But Hayes had grown nervous about his role in the conspiracy. Exchange records showed that he had attempted to withdraw from the arrangement in early March, refusing to provide additional intelligence reports and demanding payment for information already supplied. His handlers had responded with increasingly threatening correspondence, culminating in a face-to-face meeting scheduled for March 18th. The meeting had taken place at his supper table. Federal investigators who joined the case in July 1961 identified the conspiracy's organizers as members of a grain trading syndicate that had operated throughout the Midwest during the economically turbulent years preceding World War I. Most of the principal figures had died of natural causes by 1961, but their business records revealed the scope of agricultural market manipulation that had enriched urban speculators while bankrupting rural farmers. Thomas Hayes had provided them with information that allowed them to profit from the misfortune of his neighbors. When he tried to escape the arrangement, they had sent someone to ensure his silence permanently. The man who shared the Hayes family's final meal was identified through dental records, cross-referenced with missing persons reports, filed in Kansas City during the spring of 1911. Dr. Marcus Westfield, age 42, had worked as an enforcement specialist for the Hausakiachuans grain trading syndicate, a genteel title for someone who collected debts and eliminated problems that threatened the organization's profitability. Westfield had disappeared on March 19, 1911, one day after the Nodaway River flood. His landlady had reported him missing when he failed to return to his boarding house. But Kansas City police had assumed he was another victim of the spring floods that claimed dozens of lives throughout the Missouri River Valley. The truth was more complex and infinitely darker. Westfield's body was discovered by federal investigators in July 1961, buried in a shallow grave on property that had once belonged to Walter Brennan, the Grange member who had advocated direct action against Thomas Hayes. Brennan had died of heart failure in 1953, but his son Robert provided details about the night his father returned home covered in mud and carrying a stranger's gold watch. Father said he'd found a man wandering in the bottoms after the flood, Robert Brennan told investigators. Said the man was delirious, claimed he'd poisoned a family, but couldn't remember how to find his way back to town. Father thought he was addled by the trauma of surviving the flood, so he took him in for the night. But when morning came, Father realized the man was talking about the Hayes place, about sitting at their table and watching them die. Walter Brennan had faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Turn the murderer over to authorities and risk exposure of the grain trading scheme that had enriched half the farmers in Nodaway County, or eliminate a witness whose testimony could destroy the economic foundation of their community. He chose silence, as his neighbors had chosen silence about the Hayes family's suspicious disappearance. Westfield died from a blow to the head, delivered with a mattock that Brennan buried alongside the body. The grain trader's gold watch stopped at 9:47, the same time recorded by Thomas Hayes's railroad timepiece. The investigation concluded in September 1961 with indictments that would never be prosecuted. Most of the conspirators had died of natural causes, while those few who remained alive were deemed too elderly and infirm to stand trial for crimes committed 50 years earlier. The legal system that might have provided justice for the Hayes family had been defeated by the passage of time and the complicity of silence. But justice, as the people of Nodaway County learned, could take forms that transcended courtrooms and legal procedures. Walter Brennan's farm, once the most prosperous in the township, had suffered a series of misfortunes that began the year after he murdered Marcus Westfield and continued until his family abandoned the property in 1952. Crops failed during favorable growing seasons, livestock died of mysterious ailments, wells went dry despite abundant rainfall. The land itself seemed to reject cultivation, as if the soil remembered what had been buried in it. Robert Brennan's confession to federal investigators included details about his father's final years that suggested a man haunted by his choices. He'd stand at the kitchen window every evening, watching the bend where the Hayes place used to be. said he could still see lamplight in their windows sometimes, like they were waiting for someone to join them for supper. Toward the end, he stopped eating meals with us, said food didn't taste right anymore, said everything tasted like metal. The grain trading syndicate had dissolved by 1915, its members scattered by the economic disruptions of the Great War and the federal regulations that followed. The agricultural intelligence network that had enriched them was replaced by government crop reporting services that eliminated the informational advantages on which their scheme had depended. But the broader pattern of exploitation that the syndicate represented continued in different forms, as rural communities found themselves subject to economic pressures that favored consolidation over family farming, efficiency over community stability, and profit over the human relationships that had once defined agricultural life. The Hayes family had died because they tried to escape a system that treated farmers as expendable sources of information and labor. Their deaths had been forgotten because that same system rewarded those who chose profitable silence over costly truth. The Hayes cabin site was designated as a historical marker in 1963, though the inscription mentions only the family's disappearance in the flood of 1911. Visitors who stop at the roadside plaque find no mention of strychnine or grain market manipulation, or the complicity that allowed 5 murders to be disguised as a natural disaster. The full story, documented in federal case files that remain sealed under grand jury secrecy rules, has never been publicly acknowledged by local or state authorities. But the river remembers what institutions choose to forget. During flood seasons, when the Nodaway rises beyond its banks and reclaims the bottomland that was once the Hayes family farm, residents of Miller's Bend report seeing lights in the windows of houses that no longer exist. Some claim to hear voices carried on the wind, a family saying grace before a meal that will never be finished, waiting for a guest who has already departed into the darkness. Local folklore insists that anyone who sees these phantom lights will find unexpected visitors at their own supper table within a year, strangers who arrive with business propositions that seem too profitable to refuse. Those who accept the propositions, according to the stories passed down through 3 generations of Nodaway County families, discover too late that some debts can only be paid in silence, and some secrets demand a final accounting that transcends the grave. The Hayes family vanished on a March night in 1911, but their story continues to surface whenever greed masquerades as prosperity and communities choose complicity over justice, which means it surfaces more often than the living care to admit. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.